Welcome to Real Scoop Live, a show for pool chemistry enthusiasts where we talk about all the coolest chemistry stuff you never knew you wanted to know. Any chemical advice or suggestions are opinion and utilized at the discretion of each individual pool operator. With that out of the way, let's start the show.
Hello and welcome to the Real Scoop Live. Today, we have Rick Hamilton with us from Rick's Remedies. Stacee and the boys, as usual, coming to you from our corporate headquarters in Jupiter and our satellite offices in Indianapolis and Texas. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to the boys and they're going to talk to you about chlorine. So take it away, guys.
All right. Thank you, Stacey. Yeah, we are so happy to have our initial guest star or guest
Co-host
with Rick Hamilton from Rick's Remedies. Rick, thanks for being here, buddy.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. If you want to check out my blog, it's on our API website at apiwater.com. You might want to check it out. We make it simple. We don't go real in depth like these geeks that are here with me today. We just kind of make it simple for consumers or anybody that's interested in it. Really thrilled to be here today, and this is a great thing going on. So thanks for having me today.
All right. So one of the big things that Rick's been dealing with over the past couple of years as he runs the troubleshooting arm of our CET, which is our customer experience team, is the calls that he gets on chlorine lock. And what we were talking about just prior to this in our pre-show is the idea of chlorine lock, but also the how many people are now having that kind of issue. And I say, how many people? There's like 10 million pools, right? People call us because we've been, between the three of us, we have roughly, 80 years of chemical experience, and we get the really hard questions to answer. So typically people don't call us to find out how to adjust pH. They call us when there's something that's like out of this world. As a matter of fact, we were talking to a friend of ours up in Wisconsin that was calling and saying, look, I've done 100 pools a week for 30 years. I know what I'm doing, but this one pool is unresponsive. And then that started a discussion about what unresponsive could mean, because you can use it as a catch-all, whether it's unresponsive chemically, unresponsive mechanically, unresponsive to chlorine, which a lot of people call chlorine lock. And so we started talking about all these different things and trying to put them together so that we can have a succinct RSL, right? Because we want to try these things to be right around 15 minutes. So let's kind of go some of the points, the finer points of what we talked about. So Brett, what's the list you want to talk about today?
Well, overall, chlorine lock is kind of a catch-all term for a lot of folks out there when there's an issue with chlorine or an issue getting a good chlorine reading or an issue where it seems like chlorine isn't performing or building. And it's kind of turned into a MacGuffin where if you don't know what the exact issue is, just blanket term, call it chlorine lock. Generally, the solution a lot of times is just dump more chlorine in it and call it good. The fun part is that actually fixes it a lot of times if you add enough chlorine. But overall, there's better terms or better descriptions of problems that are out there. So instead of being really broad and just calling it chlorine lock, you could call it something along the lines of excessive cyanuric acid that's reducing the effectiveness of the chlorine in the water at higher concentrations. You could call it excessive combined chlorine that's preventing a good solid free chlorine reading from building. And that kind of goes into other issues as well, because if you've got combined chlorine, the common wisdom is let's throw more chlorine at it to burn that out of there. If you don't add enough, though, you could potentially just be creating more combined chlorine and making it harder for yourself down the road to actually resolve that issue too. So really, it's more we need to get better as an industry of specifying what the specific issue is rather than just calling it it's a blanket term.
So what I look at this is I think of it as contaminant load, right? And contaminant load is kind of like it's a catch-all, because you have to think about what kind of contaminants are in the water that chlorine could essentially take care of, or do you need other help, right? If your filter's not working right for whatever reason, well, I mean, that's letting contaminants go past the filter. If your filter's dirty and you haven't cleaned it, well, then you have a whole bunch of contaminants in the water that also have to be oxidized. So there's you can use chlorine lock as a catch-all when you're talking to a consumer, because they're probably not going to understand stuff like combined chlorine, breakpoint chlorination, contaminant load, or any of the other things. But in your mind, when you're talking to them, you can say, look, how do I treat this the best way, right? If it's breakpoint chlorination, I can figure out how much chlorine you need to put in, that's fine. But like you said, when we talked about UV and all this other stuff, there's a lot of things to take into consideration. And it's really easy just to say, okay, well, try more chlorine. But is that really fixing the problem, or is it adding to the issue? And the biggest issue for all of us in the industry is that if we don't get it right quickly, then people start to lose confidence in our ability to help them. So let's talk a little bit about each one of these in turn. So Rick, do you want to, I know that chlorine lock is near and dear to your heart. I know that, cyanic acid is something you know a ton about. Do you want to, as our guest host, do some talking about some of the stuff that you've come up with as far as helping people that contact CET for help?
Yeah, I mean, usually they're calling in and saying, "Wow, my pool is green," and I start asking questions. It's not responding to things, so I start asking questions like about their readings. Obviously, the first things we do is check that most of the things that we can measure are in range, because a lot of things can cause problems like high pH, where the chlorine may be there but not be reacting or active. So a lot of people don't realize the relationship between pH and chlorine. So they could actually have chlorine in their pool, but if you have a pH of 8 or higher, the activity level is very low. So we kind of go over that a little bit, and then we look at their other balancing things. One thing that I concentrate on is, like we talked about, the stabilizer level. If that gets too high of a range, that is also going to make the chlorine, like you spoke earlier, to a more inactive level. We look at the free chlorine, the combined chlorine, and stabilizer.
Hey, Rick, how do pools get cyanuric acid or high cyanuric acid in them? What's the fastest way?
Yeah, I mean, the fastest way right now is if people are buying dichlor from big box stores, that's loaded with stabilizer, and also trichlor tablets. So they may not realize that they're putting that in. As they're putting in, their stabilizer is going higher and higher. And unfortunately, the only way to get that back down is to drain off water. Hold
on. The only effective way, right? The only 100% effective way. Sorry.
Right. That's exactly right. Yes, there are some products out there that do it. We've had mixed results on those products. So the most efficient way, and probably the least expensive way in most cases, unless your water is really expensive, is to just drain off a certain amount, get that stabilizer down to 55 or below, to where we feel like it's a comfortable level to have. The other thing we see in a lot of these pools is a high combined chlorine, which we're going to talk a little bit more about. Breakpoint chlorination, and how you really have to do it correctly, or it can make your problem worse. But typically, once we look at those things, we'll often recommend our products like Revive to get out contaminants. We recommend shocking the pool and provide the proper amount of level based on their water capacity and how many gallons are in their pool. And typically 9 times out of 10, this will solve their problem. But then we're going to get into down the road here a little bit unresponsive pool, when that doesn't fix the problem. So with that, Matt, I'm going to turn it back to you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. So obviously cyanuric acid is a big issue, and anyone that's been in the industry for a long time knows that, say, like 15, 20 years ago, cyanuric acid wasn't that big of a thing. As a matter of fact, they used to recommend to have it between 40 and 100 parts per million. Nowadays, it's down to about 40 to 60, unless you have a salt pool, which is around 70 to 80. But if you look at some of the stuff that's come out from the CDC, you're talking about in commercial pools, most commercial pools, they want you to be at 15 right? So with that, it's all the ramifications of what that means, right? Because how hard is it to keep a pool at 15 parts per million of cyanuric acid in order to keep the chlorine as effective as possible? And that really comes down to like kill rate and stuff like that. That's what they're looking at. And that's stuff that when you're dealing with backyard pools, you're not really thinking about that. But there is some stuff in the industry, if you've read any of the industry mags recently, that talk about the 7.5 principle. And the 7.5 principle is that if you take whatever cyanuric acid you have in a pool that you're treating, that you need 7.5% of whatever that cyanuric acid reading is as a residual for the chlorine. So if you have 100 parts per million of cyanuric acid, you really should be carrying a 7.5 parts per million of chlorine in order to keep that residual effective and the kill rate high enough to get rid of the, the heebie-jeebies that get into the pool.
Free chlorine.
Free chlorine, 7.5. So what we were talking about is if that's the case, think about that as a symbiotic or a circular issue, is that if you're using enough chlorine to keep the water at 7.5 parts per million of free chlorine, then you're adding more tabs or more dichlor or whatever that is then adding more to the cyanuric acid level, which means you need to add more of the chlorine to keep the residual. And so it's a big CF.
It builds on itself and it just makes it worse.
Right. So with that in mind, think about all the people that come in that have a cyanuric acid of 150 or 200 or 300. And all those people have issues with what? They have issues with cloudy water if they don't have a DE filter. They have, cloudy water. They have issues with recurring algae. They have issues with all kinds of stuff that happens because of the effective chlorine is not there, right? We've had an influx of white water mold, right? I mean, white water mold and fungus and bacteria and all that stuff recently. The last RSL was all about white water mold. And believe it or not, this is one of the issues that contributes to that. It's like if that fungus and the mold and the bacteria get in the water and you don't have an effective sanitizer, well, that just creates many more problems. Go ahead,
along those lines as well, if your cyanuric acid is excessively high and you do have combined chlorine issues, think about that in terms of what you have to add to the water to actually break the combined chlorine out of there. Because if it's 7.5 parts per million of chlorine to equal 1 part per million, or was it 1 or 3, Matt?
3.
7.5 parts per million of free chlorine to equal the killing and effectiveness of 3 parts per million, that really takes up the amount of chlorine you have to add to get to breakpoint chlorination. So that's when it might be more advantageous to look at things like non-chlorine shock that can break down combined chlorine without really having to jack the chlorine that high up. But it all plays in. One leads to the other, leads to another, it leads to a boatload of problems with your water chemistry that ultimately takes a lot of product or a lot of time to fix.
I think that's probably why Cloud Out is so effective with treating chlorine demand, and Easy Pool too. But typically when people have a chlorine demand issue, we would recommend using Cloud Out because the oxidizer in Cloud Out is so much more effective than typical monopersulfate, but it also has the same characteristics in that it doesn't matter what the cyanuric acid level is, it's going to work, right? It just depends on how much you need.
It's an indiscriminate oxidizer.
Right, indiscriminate oxidizer. And I think that what you're doing is you're doing a perfect segue from cyanuric acid into breakpoint chlorination, in that if you're following along with what we're trying to lay down here, we're trying to get a lot of information into 15 minutes. And we can also go through this down in next in RSLs that come up, Real Scoop Live in the future. But if you think about breakpoint chlorination, for those of you who are not familiar with it, pretty much what happens is that you have a total chlorine reading and you have a free chlorine reading, and whatever the difference is the combined chlorine. So in order to get rid of that combined chlorine, you need to raise the free chlorine level 10 times higher than whatever that combined chlorine reading is. So in other words, if you have a 4 total and a 2 free, the difference is 2, because 4 minus 2 is 2. 2 times 10 is 20. So you have to raise the free chlorine reading 20 parts per million at least in order to break that combined chlorine down, because the combined chlorine is stuff that smells, that causes issue, causes eye irritation, all the other stuff. So the problem is contaminant load. because you can say, well, in a lab, you can add that 20 parts per million and it will break that down. But what you're not considering is that 20 parts per million, like what Brett was saying, has to be effective chlorine. So what role does the cyanuric acid play in the effectiveness of that chlorine? What role do algae spores, to algae that's in there, to other organics that are in there that would normally break that up, right? Or would normally use that up. So now you have an issue with, well, how much chlorine do you actually need? And that's where you can start thinking about, well, do I need a chlorine bomb? Do I need to do something else? Do I need to use like a product like Revive that pulls out a whole bunch of chlorine demand in one shot? Do I need to pre-treat with cloud out? Do I need to, I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that you have to try to figure out. And some of it may not work because after all these things are hypotheses, right? Because every pool has its own personality and its own problems. So what worked for the guy down the street may not work for the pool that you're dealing with now because you don't know what's in there.
Matt, you make a great point there. I mean, a lot of things, first thing I usually ask, especially if somebody's trying to clear a pool, is did you get all the contaminants out of the bottom? Like you could have piles of leaves that you can't see, and any chlorine that you put in that pool, that stuff is just going to devour before it has a chance to work. So you make a great point there with contaminants. So I just wanted to make that point that, you got to get everything out of the pool that you can before you even start this process.
And
all right, one last thing. Okay, go ahead.
A couple other contaminants that I think we'll hit on in further episodes are ammonia and nitrates in the water, which are kind of big enough to be a topic of their own. They're kind of the last thing that you check for. If you've tried everything else and nothing's worked in terms of getting a good chlorine reading, those are sort of the last two that you can look at to really help troubleshoot troubled water. Relatively easy to test, but kind of a bear to remove in both instances. Sorry, Matt, I interrupted. Go ahead.
No. So in the whitewater mold episode, we talked about ammonium nitrates was going to be a future episode. And I think that we were going to do it with this episode, but when Rick came to us about the chlorine issues that he's getting calls about, we decided to supplant those the original idea with the chlorine lock. So in our next RSL, we will talk about ammonia and nitrates. There's one last thing before we close, and this is going to be the last thing that I say other than goodbye. Sometimes it's not even thinking. It's not even something that you know that's going on in the water, right? When we talked about unresponsive as far as mechanical goes, we talked about earlier that with the rise of the variable speed motors, if the water goes through a UV system too slow, the UV system can actually break down the chlorine. So what you think you're doing correctly is actually wrong. Not wrong, but is something to be thought about. But let me just tell you a brief story. When I was in Florida, we had a lady that came in weeks and weeks in a row. She was doing everything right. Everything was balanced. She was putting in chlorine, tablets. She's doing liquid chlorine once a week. We couldn't figure out what the problem was because she never had chlorine. Then one morning she stayed home because she had a doctor's appointment, and she was sipping coffee in her breakfast nook, watching her pool. And what do you know? She sees some movement because she lived up against a like a forest, right? She sees some movement. She watches the movement. It's a raccoon. The raccoon comes down the hill, across the creek, up her embankment to her top step, and leaves a present. And she was like, if that raccoon comes here every day and takes a nice dookie on my top step, that would show me why I don't have any chlorine reading, and also why there's all these little nuts and stuff in her filter. And so what we figured out, once that was taken care of, that was the issue. So there's a lot of things that happen when you're not watching the pool that can contribute to chlorine demand that also needs to be taken into consideration. So that was just an idea of there's other things that play that you may not think about too. So
in that instance, you improved water quality with a BB gun.
Well, with something. I'm not sure what she did, but she came in the next week and said, it's taken care of now. What do I do? So, all right. So with that, Stacey, is there anything else we need to talk about? You understand everything that we got?
Yeah, you just made an argument for me that when I build my home and put a pool in, I need one of those enclosures, a fenced-in enclosure, because I don't want any dookie presents on the top step.
No. What was
Yep.
filter nuts?
Filter nuts, yeah, I'm good with those too. No.
Well, if you don't want a dookie present in your pool, don't ever invite the API crew over.
Oh. And here comes the music.
All right, here comes the music. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you on the next episode. Rick, thank you so much. Special thanks to Rick Hamilton from Rick's Remedies, API CET, Stacee and the boys. See you.